welcome to today's edition of The Unwomen. The year of 22 has been rough for all and no better for violations of human rights. This has, of course, been predicted in The Handmaid's Tale by Margret Atwood. Article 5 of the Declaration of Human Rights states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Today, we have an open discussion between five prominent scholars in the field of human experiences on the different techniques used by Atwood in this very fascinating novel. Each speaker will present their view and will clash with the ideas of others. Each view is centered around a literary technique, setting, narrative, characterization, etc. We have today Emily Octor, Tanzila Kanam, Natalie Fanning, and Charlotte Salambier. And right now we will have Natalie introduce real-world examples of where this article has been violated, as well as examples in Gilead.
Some examples of violations of this article in Gilead are the dead bodies that were hung on the wall, the public executions, and the handmaid's forced participation in these executions, and the degrading treatment of women. In the real world, violations of this article can be seen with the torture and inhumane treatment and forced displacement of at least 5,000 indigenous peoples by security forces.
And before we begin the actual discussion, it's very important for us to define what unusual torture and punishment is. So this is something unnecessary, where a less severe punishment would work just as well, or something that offends the population, or something that causes extreme humiliation. Now, degrading treatment depends on the physical and mental effects, as well as sex, age, and vulnerability of the victims. And without further ado, we will begin the discussion. So, as mentioned, the ways to measure the degrading treatment is based on physical and mental effects. And these effects are best conveyed in The Handmaid's Tale through the narrator's eyes, which is of Fred, the main character. Now, these effects are seen in how she views the world, meaning that the setting of the book foreshadows best how and why these problems are still around. So we know what has happened in the book, but the setting does not reveal it. But the setting reveals the effects of what is happening on the reader. Now we have a quote from page 22 in the book, and it states, "Above on the white ceiling, a relief ornament in the shape of a wreath, and in the center of it a blank space, plastered over, like the place in a face where the eye has been taken out. There must have been a chandelier once. They've removed anything you could tie a rope to." Now, this is a very powerful quote because it uses allegory and metonymy, which greatly enhance its meanings. Now, we can see that the eye that it says has been taken out represents what the people can see. And it somewhat ties into why these human rights continue to be violated today because the people don't know what is going on. And this also shows the mental distress of the character of Fred because the metonymy of the rope suggests the idea of suicide without explicitly stating it, as many of the handmaids have experienced this urge to end their lives to the point where they have to remove areas where people can do it. Now, this also connects to a real world example in Brazil, where activists who speak out are abused, threatened, and harassed. And this quote reveals why this keeps happening because people are afraid to speak out and their emotional state has been brought down to the point where they find it difficult to do anything about it other than ending their own lives.
I think that was a good point, but I think that narration proves the point more that. What was your point again? Sorry, I need to
Yeah, don't worry about it. So I basically said that the setting allowed the reader to gaze into the narrator's emotional state and that the
The emotional
actions.
state is why it keeps happening.
Yes.
Okay. I think that narration proves that the emotional state is not why it keeps happening, but actually what they're doing and what's in place is why things keep happening. On page 233, Atwood writes, say you're an evening rental. With this, she's objectifying Offred, but not only objectifying Offred, but also all of the women in Gilead and showing how all of these women are being treated as though they are objects that can just be passed around and rented. This is more why things keep happening, because you have these restrictions in place where women are treated as objects, and it doesn't matter necessarily the effect that it has on them, but more what's in place restricting them to not be able to break out of it.
So you think it's the restrictions more than what the people experience and what it brings them to do that causes these things? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Does anybody have any opinions on this?
I do.
I agree that the narration goes better with the idea of seeing Offred's emotions, although I do see where the setting sometimes ties into the emotions of Offred as well.
Tansy, I saw you were going to say something. Do you have anything else to put in? No? Okay. So, I see what you're saying, Emily, about these restrictions, but oh, is Tansy going to throw something in?
I had it muted on my laptop. I was talking. And I was
Don't
like,
worry.
why did you cut me off? But I was going to say that I understand that the narration walks through what is occurring, but I feel like dialogue reveals their intentions behind that instead, because it more expresses the violation of Article 5 as it indirectly analyzes the actions and how it's carried out.
But what exactly keeps things in place? Is it the intentions, the effects, or the actual restrictions themselves?
Can you repeat that?
Is it the restrictions themselves that keep things in place, or is it the effects of them, or the intentions of the restrictions that keep things in place?
Well, you see, through dialogue, I feel like it would be the intentions and the effects, because the impact of what happened is like really important for the characters, because it kind of also influences what they're gonna do in the future. For example, when Mara decides to run away and like, oh wait, let me stop. Hold on.
Okay. Well, in this moment of silence, I do want to point out, Emily, that I believe the narration of the story, or well, the narrative, definitely does justice to showing how the Article 5 has been violated in Gilead. But I think it's definitely more the character's will to do something about it that keeps these things happening in the real world. Because another quote on page 276 of the Handmaid's Tale, I'll only read a small portion of it. But at the end of it, after she sees the snow falling gently, which by the way symbolizes death, she finishes the quote by saying, "You lie back in the snow like an angel made by children and go to sleep." So this really shows how her mental state has worsened, the pathetic fallacy of the snow falling and the simile of her laying on the ground and being a snow angel made by children really shows how she just lies down and gives up, which, like the narration of the story, shows the how she's been degraded and she's really brought herself down to the point where she just wants to go to sleep. But it's really up to the people for if this thing keeps happening, which sounds bad. I know how it sounds, but really it's what the people are willing to do that keeps them or gets them out of this degrading treatment. And as I showed earlier with the example of people trying to stand up but are afraid of the government, this really shows that it's the mental state of people that keeps them down and keeps these things happening in the real world.
I see your point, but I don't agree with it.
Mm.
And I don't think we are going to agree. So I think maybe we should point in the book.
Okay. Natalie?
Is that quote from?
Well, you won't find it because I was using the PDF version, which is different from the ones you guys were given, unfortunately. But it was on
Great.
page 276.
276. Well, never mind then.
Well, do you have
So,
anything
to look at a new point, I have a quote from when. One second.
Don't worry about it.
Okay, so to look at a new quote, I have an example from when Moira attempted to escape the Red Center, and when they returned her there, she was brutally beaten. When she was beaten, her feet did not look like feet at all. They looked like drowned feet, swollen and boneless, except for the color. They looked like lungs. And that's page 91 of The Handmaid's Tale. So this quote uses most strongly visual imagery with describing how the feet look to show how basically after this torture, after this excessively harsh punishment, kind of the life is basically stripped away from Moira. They describe her feet as drowned, boneless, like lungs. So you see here how Moira's description is basically reduced to her destroyed feet. The use of the word drowned shows the kind of lifelessness, and describing her feet as boneless shows how essentially all structure is gone, and this torture has really just destroyed the core of her. So I think here you can very clearly see how Atwood uses imagery for the most part, and imagery is used the most strongly to show how this, to show how the violations of Article 5 will be carried out into the real world. And this can be tied to the real world because, as you can see with the description of her feet after her excessive punishment, you see how there was punishment beyond the actual need. So the punishment was not equal to the crime. And this is seen in the real world with how political prisoners in China will have their organs harvested.
I see what you're saying with that statement, but I do feel as though characterization does play a big role in Atwood's point of the book. Going back to Emily's quote from earlier, the quote of, "If anyone asks you, say you're an evening rental," Atwood, page 233. The connotation of rental indicates property and a level of ownership. The commander characterizes Offred as property by calling her this in the club. The rental term is also a euphemism for other means of ownership and power that the commander has over her because she is essentially a lady of the night at the club. By characterizing Offred as a rental, the commander also shows that he has a power dynamic over Offred through his commander levels of what to do if someone questions her at the club and how he indicates to her what she must do at that point. This power dynamic leaves Offred subject to the commander against her will, as her body is essentially his to obtain, use, and discard. The characterization pushes the power structure and treatment of Offred forward through her hardships in the club, as we clearly see that Offred is being abused and mistreated through this characterization, even though visual imagery is key into describing the abuse Offred faces. It doesn't go as far as characterization as it shows how the commander truly is, and it shows how Offred is as a whole as well.
So So how could you tie that example to like what's going on in the real world today?
So I would say that in the real world, there's a lot of sex trafficking that occurs, and there's a lot of instances like that we hear about in the news constantly. So that idea of sex trafficking and sexual abuse and just like sexual power dynamics as well is being portrayed in the novel as Offred is facing that head on, and the readers seeing this and realizing like, oh my gosh, this is happening to Offred, and seeing it truly play out against her as she's facing this hardship.
I think that was rather well put, and at this point in time, we'll head into a quick ad break.
Need wings to escape the torture of Gilead? Drink Red Bull. Red Bull will give you the power and courage to fight back against the commander. Red Bull gives you wings. Red Bull is not responsible for the side effects of consuming too much caffeine. Always consume caffeine with caution and do not have a lot of caffeine if you are pregnant. Be cautious with the use of caffeine.
Okay, so now we're back from our ad break, and Emily Octor would like to put a claim forward.
Okay, so for my claim, that narration is the most powerful technique because it's showing the public shaming and inhumane treatment in Gilead. During the testament, Janine tells about her experience with sex, and Offred retells about how Aunt Helena made her kneel at the front of the room, hands behind her back, where we could all see her. And this is on page 72. With this, Atwood is using a lot of visual imagery to show the public inhumane treatment that Janine is facing. Her positioning is very much like when arrested and are being handcuffed and almost restrained. They're at fault for what they did, proving how they're telling Janine that for what happened to her and showing that she is weak. A real movement and everything going on all throughout the world, the US, of how women are being shamed for speaking about their experiences with sexual assault and how that is made it more difficult for other women to speak out.
Although I agree that the body language that's shown with the narration is important, I think that the visual imagery used to describe Janine later on that same page would be considered more important. So later on that same page, page 72, it is stated that Janine's face was red. So they said, her red face and dripping nose, her hair dull blonde, her eyelashes so light they seemed not there. She looked disgusting, weak, squirmy, blotchy, pink. So I think that this really shows how they made her this experience, this made her weaker, they made her look weaker, and it created this sense of disgust towards someone who had gone through this experience. So later, Offred said that she never wanted to look like that. So that really shows how, like, in the real world, after seeing how other women are treated, after, talking about their experience, they think, I don't want to go through that. So I'm not going to share about what I went through. And I think that the way that Janine is described as kind of like a child, like they talk about how her face was red, her nose was dripping, like how she was weak. I feel like that visual description, that image that is created, is more impactful in really showing why this pushed women away from sharing their experiences.
I understand that narration and visual imagery help present the violation of Article 5, but I really think that dialogue plays the best role in displaying the violation of Article 5 in The Handmaid's Tale, because on page 80, after Janine talks about her experience with the assault, Aunt Helena goes in public and she gets all the handmaids together and she says, in reference to Janine, she says, "Whose fault was it?" And then she puts her finger up and she says, "Her fault, her fault, her fault." We chant in unison. Who led them on? Aunt Helena beams, pleased with us. She did, she did, she did. The way they all chant it helps develop conflict that bringing her trauma, from bringing her trauma and validating her. And they all like chant it to engrave the idea into her brain that it's her fault just for being a woman and being available and there in front of a cruel man that disregarded her as a person and used her for his own satisfaction. I mean, it took Janine a lot of strength to open up about this, and the way they just like disregarded everything she said and like her story and just blamed her instead of comforting her, since her body and her personal space was violated. Also, this quote helped the dialogue develop character because it just shows how mindlessly and blindly and closed-minded everyone has become from the society and the values that are implemented within Gilead, especially Aunt Helena. Publicly humiliating Janine was just not it, and like just showcase like the way she made her kneel and as she was crying and her nose was dripping, it just shows how like they violated Article 5 because they were just degrading her as a human and just kind of making fun of her for entertainment. And it seems as if they'd rather have women stay silent about cases of assault and their trauma. Um, this this situation kind of compares to a real life violation of Article 5, where Texas passed an anti-gay bill titled "Don't Say Gay," where LGBTQ plus members are not allowed to come out and are legally neglected from society for their identity, just as Janine was neglected and seen as nothing when she came out with her sexual assault story.
So you're stating that with that quote and your analysis, the clearest reason for these things to be still happening to this day is ignorance?
Ignorance, but also, wait, never mind. I don't know what your question was. I did not answer that part. Hold on.
Would you like me to restate it?
No, I have to come up with an answer to add to that later. Oh my god.
Okay. Okay. Well, does anybody else have anything to add to that?
No, I think that was a really good point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well,
Although,
okay.
although I still stand by that imagery was more valuable.
I see. Well, while Tanzila prepares a response to my very important question, we will head into another, although albeit short, ad break.
Doodle doo! Want a baby chick? Stop by your local Tractor & Co. and head towards the chicken aisle for a deal of 4 baby chicks for $1. Please note that baby chicks cannot be purchased individually or separately. No returns or exchanges allowed.
Okay, now we're back with the podcast, and Tansy has her response prepared.
Okay, so I just wanted to add on to the part where of them dehumanizing and belittling Janine for coming out with her sexual assault story, and also the anti-gay bill. It seems as if they're kind of promoting or not. Oh my god! It seems as if they're against self-acceptance and like coming out with your biggest. No, never mind. Let me shut up. Hold on. Sorry. Okay.
Okay. So basically, what I hear you're saying is that the biggest reason that these things keep happening is because of a lack of self-recognition.
Yeah, and also because they're just degrading and dehumanizing them and just being unsupportive. Because it just, like the way they treated Janine and then the way the anti-gay bill treats LGBTQ kids is like, it targets them for bullying and just self-acceptance and being able to be who they are and being able to come up with the reason, their trauma stories and like what they faced in life.
Okay, thank you, Tansy.
Wait,
And
hold on.
okay.
Let me head on to what Natalie said. And another point I just wanted to add on to is that I truly think that dialogue has the most prominent role when it comes to expressing the violation of Article 5 within the book, because of a situation that Natalie had mentioned before, where Myra ran away. So in chapter 22, where Myra decides to run away and gets abused and then beat up after she gets caught, Aunt Lydia says, "The most painful thing in this ugly incident is not the betrayal of trust, but it's the ingratitude." So I just thought that was really ironic because she left because of how belittled and unequal she felt. Like, women in this society and superior to women, whatever their sins were, was because of a woman. So, like, for example, for Janine's thing, she was blamed for it and not the man. Conflicts because it just urges Moira to want to leave even more. It emphasizes how like they failed, or Gilead and the society within Gilead fails to realize how close-minded they are. Moira, because she felt belittled and she felt like something was clearly going on, where she was desperate to escape, and then for them to bring her back and do all that to her, and like hit her foot, and the way that Natalie had described it, it just like the way Offred described it, it just shows how the dialogue and wording is really important because it leaves readers in shock and allows them to understand how badly Moira was treated. And then I also think that they had beat her up that badly to send a message to the other handmaids and women of Gilead to not dare to leave. And they kind of took advantage of Moira's escape to lash out on her and also scare the others into staying.
Well, in the interest of time, we will not have any rebuttals to that claim, but instead we will have Charlotte Salembier present her following view.
Okay, so I still think that characterization is key in Atwood's novel, and one of the quotes I chose was, "We are two-legged wombs, that's all, sacred vessels, ambulatory chalices." Atwood, page 136. Offred directly characterizes herself as inferior through her descriptions of the handmaid's purposes within Gilead. The connotation of two-legged wombs reveals that the women are no more than their reproductive organs. This characterizes Offred as she says her own role and purpose as deemed by Gilead, and it drives the point forward that the women are used for their bodies and cruelly punished if they are defiant, as if rape isn't already harsh enough. And the ambulatory chalices is a metaphor for the body of the women just being something rich in purpose, as a chalice would be rich in the purpose of holding a drink, like the women's bodies are rich in the purpose of becoming a vessel. And I talked about the real life implications of the events in Ukraine and Russia right now, as there are many men in Ukraine who are forced to fight, along with many women and children who are affected as homes are destroyed by bombs. This is an example of inhumane treatment, as Putin carelessly attacked the Ukraine and is still doing so to obtain power. Similarly, as Gilead is harming people in cruel and inhumane ways, which is proven more through Putin's and Gilead's characterization, as self-harm and selfishness is proved through the bombings of Ukraine and for the forced conception in Gilead. And also, as I thought of earlier, within the Ukraine and within Russia, Russia is trying to invade the Ukraine, and Russia is looking at it through the perspective of obtaining land and not through the perspective of how many lives are harmed in this process, and not the fact that there are people. So just as the women in Gilead are overlooked and just looked at as a womb to carry children, the people within Russia are looked at as nothing, as they're just seen as the land. It's not seen as if there are people there that need homes and need a place to live. They're just seen as land.
Interesting point. And with that, we will conclude this podcast. Now, we will not be determining which literary technique, such as setting, was the best. We will leave that up to the public or the audience. But we all can see from these pieces of evidence and this analysis that has been presented today that The Handmaid's Tale clearly draws a connection between the violations of Article 5 in her book, as well as why they continue to happen today. This has been today's edition of The Unwomen. Welcome to today's edition of The Unwomen. The year of 22 has been rough for all and no better for violations of human rights. This has, of course, been predicted in The Handmaid's Tale by Margret Atwood. Article 5 of the Declaration of Human Rights states that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Today, we have an open discussion between 5 prominent scholars in the field of human experiences on the different techniques used by Atwood in this very fascinating novel. Each speaker will present their view and will clash with the ideas of others. Each view is centered around a literary technique, setting, narrative, characterization, etc. We have today Emily Achter, Tanzila Kanam, Natalie Fanning, and Charlotte Salambier. And right now we will have Natalie introduce real-world examples of where this article has been violated, as well as examples in Gilead.
Some examples of violations of this article in Gilead are the dead bodies that were hung on the wall, the public executions, and the